agree on that. Okay, great. So I am on the slide where it has the agenda, where this seminar is going to be taking place for 2 days. The first day, we will be covering the roles and types of supervision, the clinical supervision models, the process and ingredients of clinical supervision, as well as common clinical supervision techniques. And so for these 2 days of seminar, as Dr. Hughes might have conveyed to all of you, that it is not meant to be exhaustive, so there's a lot of information. So my goal is to try to paint a broad picture of what clinical supervision is in colleagues in counseling and psychology. And I certainly would be willing to answer any questions or provide further readings if certain audience would like to dive a little bit more into certain topics. But pertaining to day 1, the 4 topics that I'll be talking about would be a lot of didactic, myself giving a lot of information as a background. For day 2, we will be talking more on the key ingredients of clinical supervision. So supervision is related to the professional relationship. So we spend a lot of time talking about the supervision relationship. Also, because supervision is really the process where the supervisor and the supervisee interact. And so we'll also spend a lot of time talking about those 2 factors. Thirdly, we will also be talking about the evaluative aspect of supervision. And then there will also be cases and examples that relates to situations and ethics that we will have a chance to discuss. I also want to point it out is that by the end of day 1, there will be in the PowerPoint a case that I would encourage everyone to go over so that we can use that as the basis for more applied discussion in day 2. So moving on to the next slide. So day 1, we're going to be talking about roles and types of supervision. So I appreciate the fact that everyone takes supervision very seriously. So in this slide, where it is a brief definition of what clinical supervision is. And so you can see clinical supervision is an intervention that is provided by a more senior member of the profession to a more junior colleague or colleagues. And sometimes it could be in the same profession, sometimes it could be a similar discipline. So the nature of clinical supervision, as you all know, is evaluative and is also hierarchical. It is also a process where it extends over time. Although sometimes it could be a one-time supervision, but this is something we can address later on. But typically, for the purpose of what I think our audience is that we in a clinical setting where you have a semester-long or year-long, where you will be providing supervision on your supervisees over a course period of time. Also, clinical supervision's idea is to enhance professional functioning of the junior person. It also helps to monitor the quality of the professional services, so that's a huge component of gatekeeping for our profession. So clinical supervision usually is not considered as an add-on because it is, in fact, a distinct professional activity. So in clinical supervision, we do provide education and training that's aimed at developing science-informed practice. And it is through a collaborative in the personal process. So often, clinical supervision involves different tasks and activities, such as observations, evaluation, feedback, facilitation of supervisees' self-assessment, and also acquisition of knowledge and skills by instruction, modeling, and also mutual problem solving. So the idea is that in clinical supervision, we want to build in the recognition of the strengths and talents of the supervisee, but also encourage self-efficacy. So there will be 2 resonating themes is that there will be a lot of teaching of the actual skills, but it is not adequate to be teaching the actual skills and knowledge to your supervisee. At the same time, we want to also facilitate this self-efficacy, where the supervisee is able to develop self-awareness of their strength and limitation, and be able to actively seek further supervision. So it is in the model of teaching the person to fish rather than just feeding them the fish to eat. So the next slide talks about trying to move to the next slide here.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you. So the primary responsibility and role of supervisor are three. There is the training of the skill. There's also the counseling perspective, where when a supervisor interacts with a supervisee, you try to facilitate the process of how the acquisition of the skill can be done to your supervisee. Certainly, like what I mentioned before. Traditionally, when people talk about clinical supervision, it is really more as a teacher teaching somebody who is more junior about certain skill sets. However, clinical supervision can at times extend to a relationship where the two individuals interacting does not have to be having that distance in terms of hierarchy, in terms of experience. So what I mean is that sometimes it could be a one-time consultation. It could be that two individuals, psychologists who are also very senior, but then one may have an expertise in certain area, and so in that case, seeking consultation is also considered as a supervision. So I think the idea is that clinical supervision can extend not over a short period of time, but it also extends across the profession. So the next slides, I would like to highlight the fact that typically in supervision, there are three types. There is administrative, there's supportive, and there's also the educational/clinical. For the sake of this seminar, we certainly focus more on the last one, which is the educational and clinical. However, in order to make sure that the supervision process is successful for your supervisee, it is imperative that all three needs to be aware of and addressed in a different way. So just to quickly go over what administrative supervision is. Administrative supervision relates to ensuring that work is performed and is performed in a manner that's consistent with the agency policies. And so common task that relates to administrative supervision is to make sure that the counselor or the psychologist contact is appropriate, and also there's punctuality. There's also good time management in terms of meeting attendance and completion of paperwork. So as the name suggests, it is very administrative. Supportive supervision is the second type of supervision, and the focus is on enhancing job performance by decreasing job-related stress that could interfere with work performance of the supervisee. And also it is meant to increase the supervisee's motivation and helps develop a work environment that could enhance work performance. So in a way, that talks more about as the role of a psychologist, where we want to facilitate a positive environment for the person to learn. And the last one about educational and clinical supervision involves the teaching of the supervisees the skill set that they need in order to be a competent psychologist, but at the same time developing a good sense of self-awareness so that they can be aware of the times where they need to seek supervision in the future. So in educational and clinical supervision, they could be done by two different entities. I once used to work in a clinical setting where I served as a clinical supervisor. And so supervision can be from a site, clinical supervisor. And the role would be to emphasize on the refinement of the counseling, and intervention skills so that the supervisee can better deliver the services to help the client's successful outcome. Now, with the work that I'm doing as a faculty member here, as a university-based supervisor, I also take part in supervision. But my focus, rather than focusing on the skill sets to enhance clients' outcome, my focus would be more focusing on teaching and learning goals for the supervisee. So the idea is that all this is done by analyzing the supervisor's interaction with the clients and then teaching them how to provide specific services and knowledge so as to help with the clients. Again, it's just that the focus is a little bit different. So before I go on to the next one, which talks about a broad conceptual model of clinical supervision, I want to highlight that sometimes as a clinical supervisor, it is really difficult to perform all three types, meaning the administrative, supportive, and clinical. There are certain agencies or certain disciplines where I've seen that individuals will have multiple supervisors. And it could be an administrator who could provide support for the administrative supervision, whereas as a psychologist, in the clinical setting, I see myself doing more of a clinical supervision as well as a supportive role of supervision. So moving on to a broad concept of clinical supervision. You will see in this diagram and also the three different aspects of clinical supervision, which we call a Cupid model. So the first part is the parameters of supervision. So you'll see that there are different aspects that need to be addressed in relation to the relationship process, the individual differences, the understanding of supervision models, ethical and legal considerations, as well as evaluation. Pertaining to supervisor's task in terms of what we do in facilitating supervision, there are certainly many different types that we can go over, and it will also be the more focus later on for this webinar. But broadly speaking, there's life supervision, there's group supervision, there's also individual supervision, and also organizational supervision. Now, something that is also important to take into account is also the supervisee's developmental level. So you will see that in terms of supervisee, there could be individuals who are at the beginning stage where they are more novice in terms of their learning. Like what I mentioned before, sometimes it could be another colleague who are also very senior in terms of their experience. However, it could be an expertise or an area that may need some further supervision. So in that case, supervision could also be a process where another person can provide supervision for another expert. So the next few slides is also a broad introduction about what are some of the clinical skills, supervision skills, and also considered as good behaviors for supervisors for the audience to consider. So the clinical skills, it would also be related to evaluation, as we will be talking about in the second day. So this is certainly very unique and specific to specific disciplines, and not only within psychology, but also among different disciplines. So social workers, business, there are different types of specific clinical skills or practical skills that needs to be addressed. But this slide that pertains to the clinical skills would be more in line with individuals in the healthcare profession, meaning psychologists, counselors, and social workers. So in real time, I'm not going to be reading them all out, but you will see that there will be tasks that relates to individual group counseling, communication skills, micro skills in counseling, conceptualization skills, assessment, diagnosis. There may be specific methods or techniques of counseling or psychotherapy that needs to be acquired, written skills, verbal skills, and on the right you will see that there's also the ethical guidelines and standards that the supervisor needs to know. knowledge of understanding kind of the broader system about the interactions among systems, individuals, family, environment, and also the presenting problems of the clients. The awareness of multicultural aspects in impacting on the services, and also understanding the role of developmental factors in the client's problem. So the next slide talks about us as supervisors. What would be some of the things that we need to be aware of? So it is highlighted that it is important that as supervisors, we need to know the role and functions of what we do. We need to also be having a good understanding of the basic models, methods, and techniques of clinical supervision, and also being able to articulate a personal model of supervision and structure of supervision, and to be able to implement a variety of supervisory interventions, such as individual, group, life supervision, etc. It is also important for supervisors to understand the importance of supervisory relationships and be able to facilitate it, which we will also talk about in the second day. Also, the role of how systems, cultures, and environment can affect the supervision process. As supervisors, we need to be mindful of as well. Ethical, legal issues related to clinical supervision, familiar with the methods of evaluation of the supervisor's competency, and also ability to apply that throughout the supervision is also important. Now, there also it's important to understand that there is the understanding of the requirement and procedure for licensure and certification for supervision, and also something I added on is that sometimes when we supervise supervisees, it's always nice when they all are very successful. But at times of when they struggle, it's also important that we understand and be aware of what are the process and remediation tasks that could be done, so that we are also being able to help the supervisee for gatekeeping purposes. In terms of the next few slides about effective behaviors for clinical supervisors, you will see that there are certain aspects such as being able to clarify expectations and style of supervision, maintaining consistency and appropriate boundaries, be knowledgeable about theories and current research, teach practical skills, case conceptualization skills, also making sure that there's frequent, scheduled, regular supervision with the supervisee, being able to be open and available for your supervisee, encourage the exploration of new ideas and techniques, foster autonomy, models appropriate ethical behaviors and counseling skills, had a personal therapeutic style, personally and professionally mature, perceive growth as an ongoing process, rather than expecting a supervisee being able to do well without having the leeway that they can actually improve. There's also, in addition to what I just mentioned, there's also important that clinical supervisors be able to assess the learning needs of the supervisee, providing constructive feedback and positive reinforcement, showing that you invest in the supervisor's development and care about the well-being of others, having the ability to be present and immediate, has the awareness of personal power, and later on we'll talk about how the hierarchy and also as a supervisor being powerful in a power position could be detrimental, but also it could be helpful as a supervisee. It's also important to have the courage to expose vulnerabilities of yourself, be able to make mistakes and take risks, and also model how that could be done to facilitate growth in your supervisee. But it also talks about being able to encourage your supervisee to take risks and make mistakes, but at the same time, you as a supervisor being able to facilitate growth for the supervisee. Also, being able to have a non-authoritarian and also non-threatening style would be always welcoming. Accepts and celebrates diversity, and having the ability to communicate effectively. Willing to negotiate and willing to work collaboratively, and also being able to aware and accept that there is a limitation and strength. So the next, I would like to discuss a little bit more about the clinical supervision models. So in general, in this slide, you will see in the diagram that there are three main types of clinical supervision models. So the far left is models that are grounded in psychotherapy theory. So depending on your professional training, a lot of times clinical supervision mimics and the intent and also the focus of your supervision style. So this itself, certainly we cannot discuss all of them in details, but I would focus more on the developmental models and the process model. So the developmental model talks about the development of the supervisee, and the process models talks about what would be the task and ingredients that would be important in providing supervision. Now, as you can tell, there are a lot of different models, but the one that I would be highlighting on would be under the first one, the models based on the psychotherapy. I would certainly highlight the psychodynamic and also behavioral as an example. But for the developmental model, I would highlight the second one, the IDM model. And then the third one for the process, I would highlight the first one, which is the discrimination model. So, like what I mentioned before, psychotherapy models really is grounded based on the training orientation of the supervisors, and I will use an example to show how that could be done. So, psychodynamic, as you all know, psychodynamic model focus a lot on the relationship. So it certainly informs a lot of clinical supervision regardless of any kind of orientations. So working alliance is the key in as a focus on the psychodynamic aspect of clinical supervision. The aspect of parallel process is also highlighted because, as you can imagine, as a supervisor working with a supervisee, this relationship certainly mimics what the supervisee will do with the client in terms of the therapeutic relationship. So like what I mentioned before, psychodynamic model of clinical supervision inform the practice and theories of supervisions of all orientations. The role of supervisor acts as a therapist or teacher, whereas the supervisee is more as a client or student. So the components of psychodynamic model is to help to understand the role of personal issues in supervisory relationship. It also helps to encourage insight, self-exploration, and continual reality testing. There's also an understanding of the presence of intrapsychic issues such as transference, countertransference, and resistance. In terms of behavioral model is the purpose is to teach the supervisee counseling skills and behavior. And so I think this one is most effective in the use of training micro skills for the supervisee. So some of the techniques that are commonly used would be using behavioral description to objectify goals and to define success, and also using self-management methods such as checklists, techniques, relaxation to help the supervisee to grow. And so the reason why I highlight those two is because, consistent with what I mentioned, in order to facilitate a positive clinical supervision process, the therapeutic relationship is important. So that is addressed by the psychodynamic model. But at the same time, in order to be able to teach the supervisee the skill set, using behavioral techniques would be most conducive in helping with that. I'm going to skip this slide because this is really to indicate that developmental models really focus on the development of the supervisee, understanding that at different levels their growth may be different. So the one example that I would like to highlight on for the developmental model is called the IDM, Interpersonal Development Model. So you will see in this slide is that on the x-axis, on the far left, there's the supervisor, where it talks about the fact that as an advanced supervisor, your role is really to help with the confirmation of identity and the role of your supervisee. As an immediate level, the supervisor often play the role of helping for exploration of the supervisee. And at the beginning stage of the supervisor, usually one comes across as an expert and having more structure as a supervisor. If you look at the orange area where it highlights supervisee, it talks about the different levels for supervisee, namely beginning, intermediate, and also advanced level. So what you see is that if you go down to how it matches with the supervisor's role towards the end, you will see that for the beginners, supervisor usually takes more of a teacher and monitoring of the progress of the supervisee. As the supervisee moves to the intermediate level, the collaborative effort would be more mutual in the sense that the supervisor takes the role of an evaluator and also challenge the supervisee to improve and enhance the skills. So often the relationship could be somewhat conflictual because there's a lot of pushing the button of the supervisee. I forgot to mention that for the beginner supervisee, the supervisee certainly takes more of a dependent role on the supervisor. So in that case, the goal is usually set by the supervisor. So it's more directive from the supervisor's perspective. In the intermediate level, the supervisor and the supervisee certainly could set mutual goals rather than directed by the supervisor. For advanced level supervisee, the relationship would be more autonomous. The goals could be directed and guided by the supervisee. And so the role in this case would be more of a consultant and colleague. So in the next few slides, I provide more examples about certain aspects that would be helpful. So in this slide, it shows that the level of supervisees in different developmental stages. So this is more structural. It does not always mean that that's the case. But what it usually highlights is that at level 1, the supervisee tends to be at the master's level at the beginning of the training. And so there needs to be a lot of structure imposed by the supervisor. And the supervisor takes more of a teacher's role. In level 2, the supervisee could be at the master's level, but more at an intern, so they may have already have some clinical experience, and so they certainly may experience more of a conflict between wanting to be independent, but also desire a sense of autonomy. So it's kind of like in the process of growing towards being independent, but they also there's the need for them to be more independent, dependent on the supervisees in terms of guidance. Now, level 3 supervisee typically is a postmaster's degree and doctoral level supervisee, and so the developmental stage is certainly more stable, relatively speaking. And at this level, they certainly are more desired to promote mutual sharing. They feel more comfortable facing challenge and confrontation from the supervisor. So in that case, the supervisor's role would be more as a consultant. So the next slide talks about supervisory development. This is more of a personality attribute. What I would like to highlight is that, consistent with the previous slide, level 1 is more of a beginners. And so what you see in terms of the personality of a supervisee would be more anxious and more naive. The supervisee really wants to impress the supervisor, wanting to do the right thing. And so they want to assume that they are perfect. They want to portray themselves as the expert. Level 2 is confusion and conflict, which usually is short-lived, and supervisors usually experience fluctuating motivations. Level 3 is that the motivation of the supervisee tends to stabilize, and they certainly are growing in terms of having a more sense of autonomy. So those would be. So here I also highlight that there's also the three level 3 also has 2 different levels. Level 3 itself is that supervisor's motivation and commitment is very consistent, is improved, more accurate, and in terms of the self-appraisal. The level 3I would be the mastery of supervision knowledge and skill. So that means that the person is more advanced in terms of being successful. Now, I want to apologize for this yellow highlight. I originally meant to have a link to provide this measure that would help for supervisor to give the supervisee to assess, roughly speaking, where the supervisor's level is. But what I would do is perhaps I would send the forms. There are a couple of forms from this day 1 that I would like to send to Dr. Hughes, so you can share with the audience. But this is one that I find it helpful in assessing the supervisee's developmental level. So I will skip to the next slide, about the next few slides, to move on to the process model. The process model, the one that I would like to highlight, is the discrimination model. Discrimination model represents the third column of the supervisory models that was highlighted in the diagram. And so in this one, it kind of talks more about at different stage what kind of tasks and the role of the supervisor should be. And so here also is another in here it talks a lot about the role of the supervisor and also the style. And so as highlighted, there is the teacher, who is more of task oriented, and the counselor would be more interpersonally sensitive. That's the most well received by supervisee. Consultation, as a consultant, the supervisor tends to be more attractive because the pressure and also the willingness to learn tends to be more intrinsic rather than extrinsic. And so here I also will provide a measure that that would assess the supervisory style in terms of the supervision. So that would be something I would send to Dr. Hughes as well. So for the discrimination model, there's certainly this quadrant about the high-load support and also the high-load direction. So you'll see that if somebody is at the high support and high direction in terms of having a lot of direction, it would be very important that the supervisor be of a supportive role, but also as a teacher. But at the same token, if somebody is requires high support, but more of a low direction, they're very intrinsically motivated, then the supervisor could take on the role of a counselor. And then with the low support and high direction, I think that would be where the supervisor could act as a directive and expert teacher. And then the last one is low support and low direction. So that would be the role of a consultant. So I think it is needless to say that it is somewhat difficult to provide a lot of the skill sets of the different types of models and techniques. But here I have enclosed a YouTube that is quite long, so I won't be able to show it here. But I would encourage those of you who are interested in understanding what the discrimination model is. Now, this one, the supervisor actually provides a didactic presentation of what discrimination model is. But starting time 10:45, this is where the supervisor provides an example of how to do discrimination model based on the needs of the supervisee, and so the supervisor has a different role as a teacher, consultant, and as a counselor. So I think that would be very helpful if those of you who are interested to look at that.
And Dr. Lee, I just wanted to reflect this as well, that with the 2 sessions that we have dedicated towards supervision, this could easily spend 4 semesters worth of coursework into the content that you're presenting. So I realize you're trying to pack a lot into these 2 days that we have together. And so I really do encourage the audience to save these slides. Again, we will be disseminating them and posting them, and use this as a resource to turn back to. That it won't end at the end of this series, but rather it'll give you a jumping off point to consider your own supervision style, what model you may choose from in working with your trainees. Maybe reflect on some of these broader theoretical issues that we may not have been trained in graduate school to even think about, and then how we assess that using the tools that Dr. Lee is going to provide us. So thank you for letting me add that.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm realizing the time, so I will certainly try to go over quickly about some of the information here. So then, traditionally, when people see clinical supervision, people usually think about individual supervision, your supervisor sitting with your supervisee and talking and processing information. However, clinical supervision encompasses certainly more than that. And so group supervision is another way that we can do clinical supervision. Rather than going through the slide, later on, I also have another, I have two models of group supervision that I also have a YouTube that would have a really good demonstration. So I would certainly skip that, but I just want to highlight that it is important that group supervision could be another way to provide supervision. However, it is important to emphasize that group supervision should not be a substitute to individual, because individual supervision is certainly important more than anything else, especially for supervisors who are at the beginning stage. So group supervision needs to be planned carefully because there would be the group pressure, but also as the facilitator, as the leader of the supervisor in the group, there's also need to be planful effort in making sure that this is done properly. Another type of supervision is triadic supervision. So technically, if it's more than 2 people, you can consider as group supervision. So I suppose you can also say triadic supervision is, in a way, a spin-off of group supervision. But this is actually very specific to just focusing on 3 people. So it would be a supervisor, but also 2 supervisees, and often the 2 supervisees could be at 2 different developmental levels. So it could be somebody who's at the master's level and somebody at the doctoral level, or it could be that somebody at have more experience and others with less. And again, with this one, I also have 2 YouTubes. They're relatively shorter, but those are examples of what a good practice of triadic supervision is in the first one, and also the second one is what is not recommended. Now, I have to say that I wish that there are more formalized training videos, but this is actually from YouTube, and the sound quality may not be the best, so I apologize, I cannot find anything that's better. But that actually would, again, give you a good idea, a rough idea about how to do triadic supervision in a way that is more effective for supervisors at different levels. So I do want to actually highlight about the next topic is on process and ingredients of clinical supervision. And so that probably would be more related to what do we do on a day-to-day in supervision. So I think it is fair to say that there certainly needs to have the initial communication. The program, university supervisor, and also site supervisor needs to initiate and communicate the expectations by writing, and also needs to meet on a face-to-face basis to establish that formal relationship. Often, there should be more of a formal interview that would be more formal and provide feedback for the supervisee. It's also common that orientation needs to be done. So from my perspective as a faculty, when we reach out to site supervisors, we also provide a short 1 to 2 hours orientation for supervision, so that the site supervisors are clear about what our expectation is, what we expect the site supervisors to be doing, and also what they expect in terms of the students' role and responsibility. Certainly, there's ongoing tasks a supervisor needs to do with the supervisee. Communication, evaluation, supervisor as an agency representative, time management, record keeping, planning for exceptions, evaluation, and debriefing. So I think one thing I kind of got a sense from Dr. Hughes in terms of what the audience may want to look at is how do we actually make the process more formalized and established so that the supervisee can take the process of supervision seriously. That also is something that we can, it's also one way that we can potentially prevent certain tasks such as resistant supervisees who don't really take supervision seriously. So I think that the key is that things need to be formalized and regular. And so there should be a supervision contract where everything needs to be documented in terms of the training elements, the frequency, length, duration, learning structure, whether it would be done through audiovisual, co-therapy, assigned reading, seminar attendance, etc., case counseling. The supervision structure, what you will be providing as a supervisor for the supervisee and the lines of authority. If, let's say, there are different hierarchy of supervisions or supervisors, how make it clear to the supervisees about where and when to go to the different level of supervisors would be very important to avoid any potential conflict and miscommunication. There's also the need to make sure that there's the agency conformity, and there's also other, meaning that what agencies expect. There's also others such as the purpose, goals, and objectives of the learning, contextual context of the services, methods of evaluation, duties, responsibility, procedural considerations, such as record keeping, how to deal with emergency and crisis situations, and supervisors' scope of practice. There's also the supervisor's views of right, which also emphasize on the supervisees what they're entitled to. And so this is very interesting because a lot of time people think that supervision is about the supervisor dictating everything, and then supervisees sometimes may not have the autonomy to actually have the say and concerns. And so again, part of formalizing the process, usually the contract, the supervisor's view of right, they're all in written format where both supervisor and supervisees are assigned so that there's a clear understanding of exactly what is expected at all parties. There's also professional disclosure statements that is required. I also provide a link to the application of approved clinical supervisor credential. And so this slide is very helpful to me in understanding how you can actually seek more formal credentialing for supervision. And so that really speaks to the fact that supervision is actually an important process that sometimes it's not just about learning on the go. There's certainly a lot of professional organizations that provide services and training for a fee so that somebody can actually acquire a credential in supervision. So if you're okay, I'm going to skip a little bit on the actions and practices. This slide, the diagram, kind of summarize what a supervisor's role and in relations to the supervisee's level of experience at the beginning, immediate, and also stages. And then the bottom part kind of outlines, roughly speaking, what do we do in terms of supervision process and the task at the beginning, immediate, and also the advanced stage.
So Dr. Lee, with your permission, we have a few minutes left before we reach the end of the hour, and given that we do still have another hour next week, I'm wondering if we've met maybe a breaking point where we could take some questions and then maybe defer the rest of this content to next week, just so that we can get a couple questions in discussion and then pick up where we left off next Wednesday.
Sure, that sounds good. Maybe I can talk to you a little bit more about whether you would like me to just talk about the techniques in the next sessions, or you would like the audience to go over and come up with questions, because I'm aware that the second day there's also a lot of PowerPoint slides to cover. So I can defer to your guidance how we can do that.
Yes, so I think, one, I would certainly encourage the audience to review the slides. We can get these sent out to the email list of those who signed up today, and then also get it posted to the website probably within a few days. But in terms of, I guess, questions, one thing that's been in the back of my mind and was also submitted prior to the webinar today was a lot of us work in hospital settings where we may not have received formal supervision training on how to provide supervision the way that you presented it today, again, with this wonderful theoretical model. Instead, we may be observing more of a medical model of supervision that's a much more fast-paced of, for example, see one, do one, teach one. And so having this very different framework and thinking of how we can, marry those two very different styles. I'm curious what your thoughts on that for rehab psychologists in applying some of these kind of theoretical foundations.
Sure. That's a very good question. I would say choosing so two things. I think choosing the process model where it provides very concrete idea about what would be some of the skill sets that the supervisor needs to be trained would be one way, so that you will be able to know what needs to be what would be the expectation about the competency of the supervisee. But another way, which is very common in what I see, is that meta supervision. So it could be that, let's say, if I just finished my PhD and I'm in my postdoc, and I'm interested in learning about supervision. It may not be a bad idea that as an early career psychologist, you try to provide supervision, but you yourself also seek somebody who's more senior in your agency to be able to process the information. So I think the idea about meta supervision would be one thing that I would see as a common way, so that you provide supervision for let's say master's level supervisee, but the parallel process of you going back to a more senior person and reporting on what you have done, that there's a check-in. I think that would be probably the most effective way I can see to help.
Okay. I'm going to unmute our attendees so that for those of you who are able to stay a few extra minutes, and Dr. Lee, if you're able to stay on a few extra minutes as well, we can answer some more questions here.
Sure.
So I'm going to Q&A. Everyone should be able to unmute themselves. And if folks do have questions, feel free to chime in. If there were certain slides that were new information to you, different ways of thinking about your supervision style. Really, all of this is open for discussion. So I guess I'll go through a couple other questions that were posted to us ahead of time.
Okay, sure.
So again, for a lot of our training programs, supervision is an integrated part of our competencies, and it's a goal of our program, but it may not receive as much attention when it comes to development of the training program. So particularly for early career psychologists who are starting in their first supervision experience and looking for resources, are there any particular texts or other resources you would point people to for that?
Yes, I certainly do. There's just one book by Bernard and Goodyear, 2018. That's actually in the references that I will be sharing in the second day of the PowerPoint. That one provides a very good foundation of understanding everything that I have already presented. And I also rely heavily on that textbook on my teaching of the doctoral students. More importantly, they at the back they have a series of toolbox that I also draw a lot of the resources coming that would be sharing here, and that includes a sample of what a supervision contract is like, what is the field of right. And also various assessment or measures that you can use as a way to engage in conceptualizing what kind of supervisory style you are, what kind of supervising needs, outcome, therapeutic alliance, etc. So what I was hoping to do is in the second webinar. I will want to do this like hyperlink so that in the PowerPoint itself, you could all click and be able to get access to some of the measures that I find very helpful. That would also ties into some of the aspects that we are talking about, such as the alliance, role ambiguity, etc. So that book, I would say I highly recommend that you could consider buying, and so that would be the one book that I think it is really useful.
Wonderful, thank you. I can also see just with the different models how not everyone would adhere to one particular model of supervision, but you may use an integrated model as well, and that may be something that you discuss in the next webinar as well. But we use integrative models within our clinical service delivery, so it makes sense to also use that approach in our supervision style.
Yes, I think in terms of the models, in the process one, there is actually one model that I think I find it very appealing, but just because of the time, I just select one that is most commonly used. I can certainly add back on a diagram in at least having some the audience to know conceptually what it is. It is called the Systems Approach to Supervision, SAS. And so for this one, I actually find that it is very realistic in terms of not just looking at what would be the clinical skills that the supervisor needs to know, or what is the developmental level of the supervisee. Rather, it talks about the importance in the supervision relationship. It talks about the supervisor, supervisee, the client, the organization. So it pretty well provide like a bullet point about what are all the important aspects that you need to be mindful of when doing supervision from a more systems perspective.